We were told that you were dangerous, that you were backward, and that you needed saving. And while bombs fell on your cities, screams in our homes told us it was justice. We didn't know. Not because the truth was absent, but because the truth was buried.
I, without qualification, apologize for the pain and the hurt and the indignity and the damage that apartheid has done to black, brown, and Indians in South Africa.
Systemic racism didn't just hurt black people, although they were the ones that took most of it, but it also misinformed white people.
Every piece of news, every message we were getting, every joke, the butt of every joke was the stupidity of the black man, the inability of the black man to look after himself, never mind the country, to be ignorant, uneducated, break everything he touched. The messaging was that all violence was black violence.
To those in Africa, please hear this. We were told stories. We were raised in shadows. We were born into the same machinery that took from you. We were told that you were dangerous, that you were backward, and that you needed saving. And while bombs fell on your cities, screams in our homes told us it was justice. We didn't know. Not because the truth was absent, but because the truth was buried. Layer upon layer of propaganda, schooling, news feeds, speeches, until even compassion was trained to look the other way. We, the ordinary people of the West, were made to believe it was for freedom, for safety, and for progress. But we see now, we were lied to, manipulated, and enlisted in an empire without our consent. The same empire that looted your lands, looted our minds. We were told stories. We were raised in shadows. We were told that you were dangerous, that you were backward, and that you needed saving. And while bombs fell on your cities, screams in our homes told us it was...
Black people know things white people don't. Before I go on, you can check my video notes for the references I used to create this video. Generations of white Americans were raised with a story that made us feel like heroes. We learned about abolitionists, not about the banks that provided insurance on enslaved people. We learned about the civil rights movement, but not about the white mobs who terrorized black families for trying to move into a better neighborhood. Systemic racism didn't just hurt black people, although they were the ones that took most of it, but it also misinformed white people, and that pisses me off. It trained us to see unfairness and injustice as progress. That's why when black folks talk about redlining, medical racism, or why certain laws hit their communities so much harder, many white people are just confused, or worse, and probably more commonly, they're defensive. It's not just ignorance, it's conditioning. The system made sure we didn't see the whole picture, because once we did, we might start asking too many questions. White people need to hear the truth from people who live it. But that takes a toll on black people. They've had to survive what we've only begun to learn about. And it's not fair to put that burden on them. That's why I study, listen, and talk to other white folks. It's not about guilt, and it's not about blame. It's about repair. Black people already know this history. White people need to know it too, because it's our history. It's our history too. Silence keeps the system working in the way that is unjust. Don't be afraid. You should be mad. about what was kept from you on purpose. Now you have the opportunity to learn about it and start organizing your life differently. I am not an expert, but I love learning. You can put my username into your search engine. Scroll down if you want to help me out. You guys are the greatest. Get curious.
This is my last message addressed to the people of South Africa. I, without qualification, apologize for the pain and the hurt and the indignity and the damage that apartheid has done to black, brown, and Indians in South Africa. I do so not only in my capacity as the former leader of the National Party, but also as an individual. My conversion, to which I refer, didn't end with the admission to myself of the total unacceptability of apartheid. It motivated us in the National Party to take the initiatives we took. From the time that I became leader of the National Party, and more specifically during my presidency. The road forward is a difficult one. But I firmly believe that if we take hands, and if all the reasonable people in South Africa put their heads together, we can overcome the challenges we face, and we can fulfill the tremendous potential that South Africa has.
European scholars performed all sorts of intellectual acrobatics to obscure the truth about African advancement. Some even suggested that African accomplishments were the results of visitors from outer space. Any wild idea was more acceptable than to admit that Africans had the intellect and ingenuity to develop and control well-ordered empires. The purpose of all these erroneous theories was simply to justify slavery and attitudes of racial superiority. White supremacists built their bridges, constructed of lies to fill the gap between real African sophistication and false African inferiority. Because of this, a devastatingly unknowable amount of history is lost forever. Pair that with half-hearted archaeology and the Western tendency to ignore the oral histories of indigenous Africans, and you see how difficult it is to be recovered. And history was more than lost, it was banished. As the sun set on the British Empire in the mid-20th century, officials destroyed, removed, and renamed records of imperialist crimes all over the world. "What's burnt won't be missed," cried a British officer as he frantically sifted piles of papers in what was called Operation Legacy, a systematic effort to shape the legacy of the empire post-colonization.
So I grew up in apartheid South Africa as a English-speaking white boy. I only became politically conscious when I was already 18 years of age, because prior to that, I had been subjected to and sucked in this incredible propaganda of victimization of the white people, where every piece of news, every message we were getting, every joke, the butt of every joke was the stupidity of the black man, the inability of the black man to look after himself, never mind the country, to be ignorant, uneducated, break everything he touched. The messaging was that all violence was black violence, that all crime was black crime, that you had to fear black people. And a huge amount of that fear was that if we let them into the political process, into the governance of the country, that they would do to us exactly what we had done to them for decades, which would be to turn around and oppress us, to murder us, to take our stuff, to move into our houses. It was a very popular story that the ANC, prior to the 94 election, when it was still an illegal organization and Nelson Mandela was still in jail, and the armed wing was exiled to Zambia and Mozambique, Umkhonto Wesizwe, was that they promised all of our domestic servants that those servants would be given the house they worked in when the ANC ruled. And these stories were told amongst the whites to bolster our resolve never to let these black people run our country. And it was only when I became conscious of that from 18 onwards that I realized not only was this a terrible lie that was actually oppressing us as well as the people that we as a white nation, white minority, were oppressing, but that actually What happened subsequently from 1994 onwards was far more of a reflection of the nature of black South Africans than any fears we as white South Africans had been fed and believed, right? And I see direct parallels with what's happening in Palestine and Israel. We've been fed this bullshit of Israel as victim, of the Zionist government as defending, this idea that the entire Arab world wanted to wipe them off the map, when in fact, prior to the Nakba, prior to Palestine being given to Israel by the colonial powers, primarily Britain, many Jews lived very happily and harmoniously alongside Muslims and Christians within that region. They weren't oppressed there. They became the oppressor through the Zionist ambition of a few Israelis. White government for many, many years in South Africa needed the violence of Umkhonto weSizwe. They needed the odd bomb to go off. They needed terror attacks because it justified the further repression. And I've told stories about when I was in the South African Defence Force in 1987-88, 88-89. The things that were done by the intelligence service to undermine the ANC and other liberation struggles, and to pit black against black, to distract black people from action against the oppressive minority and the history of oppression. And it's time to step aside from what we've been told and look at the truth, look at the reality, look at the history, educate ourselves, and make a moral judgment based on our real values as a human.
Europeans never discovered anything. They looted, colonized, and took credit. The myth of European discovery is one of the most arrogant, historically illiterate lies ever told. Europeans didn't discover land, resources, or trade routes. They showed up late, stole shit, and renamed it. Then they rewrote themselves into the history books as pioneers. If someone breaks into your house, kills half your family, renames your living room, and tells everyone that they discovered it, that's what European exploration actually was. Columbus did not discover America. I hope you know that. Millions of people already lived here. He never even set foot in what is currently the United States. He landed in the Caribbean, got lost, then spent his time terrorizing, enslaving, and murdering the Taino people. The indigenous peoples of the Americas were thriving for 10,000 years before Columbus was even born. The Mayans, Aztecs, and Incas had cities, infrastructure, agriculture, as well as advanced knowledge of astronomy and engineering. The Norse, or the Vikings, reached North America 500 years before Columbus. But even they weren't discovering anything because indigenous people were already there. If Columbus had discovered the Americas, that would mean that you could walk into a McDonald's, discover it, and then own it. It isn't discovery, it's theft. Nor did Europeans discover Australia. Aboriginal Australians had been living there for 65,000 years. The oldest continuous civilization on Earth is Aboriginal Australia, with art, culture, and land management techniques dating back tens of thousands of years. When the British discovered Australia in 1770, they declared it terra nullius, meaning nobody's land, despite over 250 indigenous nations already living there. The British then slaughtered, oppressed, and displaced Aboriginal peoples for centuries, turning their homeland into a penal colony for British criminals. Europeans didn't discover trade routes to Asia. The Silk Road and Indian Ocean trade existed for thousands of years before Europeans even knew what a compass was. The Silk Road connected China, India, the Middle East, and Africa for 1,500 years before the Europeans even got involved. The Indian Ocean trading network, dominated by Arabs, Persians, Indians, and East Africans, had already been running for centuries before Spain and Portugal tried to muscle their way in. The Chinese Admiral Zheng He led massive expeditions across the Indian Ocean in the early 1400s, decades before the Portuguese even figured out how to round Africa. Europeans didn't discover Africa, which, if you believe that, what am I doing? Africa had thriving empires and global trade before Europeans even left their villages. Europeans like to pretend that Africa was a dark continent before they arrived, but that's complete bullshit. The Mali Empire between the 13th and 16th century was one of the wealthiest civilizations on Earth, with a vast trade network spanning across the Sahara. The Swahili coast had advanced maritime trade connecting India, Africa, and the Middle East centuries before the Europeans even showed up. Timbuktu was a major intellectual center, home to one of the world's oldest universities. When the Portuguese first arrived in West Africa, they didn't discover it. They had to ask permission from the African kings to set up trade ports. They didn't discover anything. They didn't civilize anything. They didn't modernize anything. They looted, colonized, and rewrote history. Cope.